think some brands are just full of shit, literally, like the products and the ingredients. I think some of them are based on scientific principles. Some of the products have chosen certain aspects of science to make claims for their products. I think when it comes down to it, and what I always say to people is like, if you're going to read the studies revolving around carbohydrate intake, they don't involve chia seeds. They don't involve mango purees and all this stuff. What they involve generally is maltodextrin, glucose, fructose. And they have that in varying ratios and they'll have that in varying amounts. And that is generally what they're assessing.
So you've just spent the other half's weekly grocery budget on some magic supplements to make you better at endurance sport. And they're probably going to string you up for it. We are going to have a hopefully easy to digest conversation with Scott from Fuelin on facts and fiction on common myths around nutrition and endurance sport, and hopefully set you all on the right track with where to allocate your time and energy going forward. Scott, welcome back to the podcast. I think this is number 3 for you on our podcast, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Grant. Thanks for having me back. I must be doing something right if you're inviting me back, but I'm looking forward to this one. Quick fire. I will do my best to keep the answers short, concrete. I'll probably throw things in there that might leave questions open for later and hopefully stimulate conversation. But we're shooting for 30 minutes. We'll see how we go.
All right, let's get started then. Time will start.
We've had some input from our community on these, so hopefully this is stuff people really want to hear. So Grant, you go with the first question. Let's get straight in.
Cool. Right. Number 1, complex carbs are generally considered healthier. Should we be striving to consume more of them in general versus simple carbs?
So we're doing true or false. So I will say true, yet with a caveat on context. I think defining healthier is important. The word you said, complex carbs are healthier. So I think defining what healthier means is important because the overall context is key when it comes to relevance for all aspects of nutrition. Yes, complex carbohydrates will infer lower glycemic index, probably better blood glucose control. Complex carbs also contain more fiber. Complex carbs are probably most likely going to contain higher amounts of micronutrients. So in that, they're good. Complex carbs, because they contain more fiber, are going to be good for you. Why? Because athletes and everyone should strive for more fiber. And I think I've heard it several times already last year, this year. Trend for 2026 will be fiber. Protein, fat, carbs. I think 2026, the year of fiber, and athletes focusing on it and not being scared of it. I think that's the really big thing. So yes, complex carbs, healthier for the reason of fiber. General population, just some numbers to think about. 25 grams for females, 38 grams for males. That is based on roughly 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. Now, obviously, as an athlete, when you start getting into 4, 5, 6,000 calories a day, you're probably not going to be taking in 14 grams per 1,000. So for athletes, definitely something around the 30 grams would be recommended per day. We know that athletes don't do this. Look at a few studies, recent studies where they've only been observational studies, but 3 groups, soccer, gym, runners, 16 to 19 grams per day is the general average, is what's estimated. There are flaws with some of those observational studies, of course, but it's an inkling and it's probably a decent observation, especially based on what I understand anecdotally talking to athletes, that they are generally scared of fiber. And the reason they're scared of fiber is because they're told that fiber can mess up the gut. And I think this is the misconception with fiber. Fiber is going to probably help you, and it's probably going to help with the gut. So I think considerations around fiber is it soluble? Is it insoluble fiber? Is it high fiber foods versus low fiber foods? Fermentable versus non-fermentable? FODMAPs, gut health, intestinal wall permeability, gastric emptying. These are all related to fiber, and fiber will generally improve most of those things that I've just mentioned. I think what we will see, as I said, is that you're going to see fiber as sort of one of the key things this year. And athletes, I would 100% encourage you to do it. I think it's really exciting that we're bringing in fiber tracking within Fuelin, within what we're calling Fuelin trends. So in amongst the other macronutrients, so protein, fat, and carbs, and then total calories, you're going to get insights into how much fiber you're tracking as well.
Good answer. Good answer. And we're going to come on to a question later on about GI issues on race day, and I wonder whether you're going to come back to that. So, right, this is probably the big question of the day, because this is the big trend of the last couple of years. Question number 2. All triathletes need at least 120 grams of carbs an hour to race well. If you're not hitting at least 90 grams an hour, you're under fueling.
False.
Definitely
explanation
false.
for it.
Okay.
False. That's probably all I need to say. Look, your carbohydrate intake, it's like everything. Yeah. It's context specific. Your carbohydrate intake will be related to the absolute intensity, therefore your power output, coupled with the relative intensity, the zone at which you're working in, or the RPE. Okay. We would expect that most people will be working probably in high zone 2 or at least zone 3 on race day or above, depending, of course, on the duration of the event. But, typically half Ironman, you're probably, you're going zone 3. You're working, fairly hard for a continuously long time. So relative to the intensity, your relative intensity, yes, you require carbohydrates. How much power you produce or how fast you go will determine the absolute intensity and therefore the work done, which translates to kilojoules, which translates to calories. So if you have an FTP of 120 watts and you are racing at 100 watts, you probably need 40 to 60 grams per hour. If you are pushing, let's call it male or female, definitely females over 160, 170 watts on the bike, you're going to benefit from at least 90 grams of carbs per hour. And for men, pushing probably over 200 to 10 watts for the race on the bike, certainly over 2 or 3 hours, you're going to need at least 90 grams of hour. Above those wattage, it's probably then going to depend on what you practice in training, what your total power output is, and how you feel on higher amounts of carbohydrates.
So we're talking, just putting a number on this 120 gram figure that's bandied about is in my head, immediately I would want someone at over 250 watts as a ballpark figure.
Yeah, look, I mean, you're going to have some athletes racing 220, 240 that, will benefit. They feel good on 100. Now, I think what you got to take into consideration here is, yes, for the bike, non-weight bearing, it doesn't make any difference. It is the power output. Then when you come to a weight bearing exercise like running, obviously a heavier athlete is going to have a higher caloric expenditure because of their body weight. And so even if they're not moving extremely fast, if they're very heavy and still moving at a moderate pace, they're still going to benefit from fairly high calorie, high carbohydrate intake. So I think that's important. And I think people get confused with this absolute and relative intensity discussions. I'll give you an example. Like, let's use our Chief Performance Officer, Jan Frodeno, versus Chief Nutrition Officer, Scott Tindall. So we're both doing zone 2 bike. My zone 2 bike sits up, 190, 220 watts. There's 300, 320 watts for zone 2. We're still working in zone 2. He's sort of tottering along, probably at 125 beats per minute, 130 beats, pushing 300 watts. I'm pushing along at 200, 210 watts at the same heart rate, the same relative intensity, but his absolute power is much more than mine. So even at zone 2, he could be recommended 60 to 80 grams of carbs per hour just for the zone 2 rides, because he's power output. Whereas for me, I'm probably going to take in something like 40 to 60 grams per hour. Same relative intensity. We're both in zone 2, but we're pushing very different numbers. So because he's pushing more numbers, he requires more carbohydrates and more fuel than what I would. So I hope that explains it in that way. So the take-home message is, if you don't push big numbers, you probably don't need big numbers in carbs. You still require carbs, and that is exactly what Fuelin does, is tells you based on your thresholds, which you enter into the settings, And then based on the intensity of the workout, which Phil and the team at TTT give you, we will start to advise you on the estimated amounts of carbs that you need. And then when you start doing what we call carb capacity tests, entering what you're actually taking in, after 3 of those tests, it becomes hyper-personalized to what you actually can manage. And that's the best way. And that sort of answers one of the questions later on about, how to use fuel in a race. But that's a good lead into that.
The idea of the non-weight bearing being down to pure output, and the weight bearing taken into the size of the person, no matter the sort of like power or pace output as well. I think that's a really useful one that most people probably aren't thinking about. So, yeah, Grant.
Yeah, which follows on quite nicely into the next question. During those races, when we're trying to get those carbs in, are liquid carbs always better, or can we switch that up with some solid food? What's the best way to absorb those carbs?
Yeah, so effectively, are liquid carbs better than solid food in races? It's not a true or false answer. Like everything, I'm going to sit on the fence here. Context, it depends on what you train with and what you handle in training. Okay, I tend to lean towards liquids on the bike these days for faster athletes, purely because of ease of consumption and safety as much as anything. They don't have to take their hands off the handlebars. They can have their setup with straws or bottles, and it's just very easy to get a large amount of carbs in with liquids. Even on the runs now, I am leaning more and more to like handheld flask containing a fairly high amount of carbs. Plus, it also guarantees a set amount of fluid that faster athletes might struggle to getting from aid stations and things like that. So I think that is where I sit. I think what's a really important caveat on this is cool weather racing will impact this because you can only apply your maximal sweat rate number to the amount of carbs that you can drink. Okay. What this means is otherwise you're going to be over consuming fluids to meet your carb amounts if all your carbs are in liquid form and you don't actually need that amount of liquid because you're not actually losing it. Okay. Does that make sense? So for those, lower temperature racing, switch to less carbs or liquid carbs, eat your fuel in the form of gels and blocks. So it's managing your fluid consumption in relation to your carb amounts. Hot weather probably doesn't make much difference. Go with your preference. Cool weather, you certainly want to back off on the fluids in terms of, or carbs in terms of fluids, because you may overdrink.
So that's a problem for us Europeans over here in the winter, but perhaps not for yourself over there. You can go liquid.
Yeah. Look, and that's why understanding your sweat rate, doing sweat rate tests, again, weigh yourself before the session, after the session, log it all in Fuelin. It tells you all the magic numbers and you start to get a really clear picture on how much you're sweating. And you're absolutely right, Grant. Like, you may be losing very little and therefore you only have to carry very little, which is an advantage potentially. But you then need to be able to get your fuel from other sources, i.e. solids, gels, blocks, maybe bars. Let's keep going. Run to the pump. We've still got
Good.
10 minutes.
So we had a little chat off air before we came on, didn't we? About apparently it's fine to now just take 10 grams of carbohydrate an hour when you train. So anyway, we're going to move on to fat adaptation and training fasted, which I think is probably a very confusing subject for most, based off some of the questions we were getting from the community yesterday. So I'll just ask a question that'll lead you into it. You can give me a true or false. Fasted training is the best way to become fat adapted.
False. It's a tool that can be used, and it was studied. Most studies included like crazy exercise the night before, like full on horrible exercise, glycogen depleting bike sessions, followed by no carbohydrates. So doing what they call sleep low, and then attacking another 2 hours in the morning without consuming carbohydrates or very limited carbohydrates to create these adaptations. Most of the adaptations didn't result in any performance gains anyway. Since then, they've shown that training low after like glycogen depleting exercise the night before is not even required. pretty much, it's a tool in the toolbox that can be used if you want it. Ultimately, losing weight. Okay, we're talking about fat adaptation. I think this is where people will get confused. Getting fat adapted doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be losing weight. Losing weight or losing body fat comes down to calorie intake or being in a calorie deficit. Becoming fat adapted means that you become metabolically more flexible and that you have a better, your body can utilize different fuel sources at differing intensities better, i.e. fat. As you start to progress through intensity, you continue to use more fat than carbohydrates until a point where it effectively crosses over. So for me, fasted training is a tool that can be used. Would I recommend it for a lot of people? No, I don't think it's necessary. And we will talk. I think you've got some other questions around training. Did you, or maybe I put this in? Okay, there's two other points here I want to make about this fasted training. So if you're training 1 to 2 times a day and training consecutive days, I want you to consider this, that there is liver glycogen and there is muscle glycogen. 10 grams per kilo of body weight in carbs intake will fully restore liver glycogen, but it still will not restore muscle glycogen within 24 hours. Okay, so 10 grams per kilo of body weight will restore your liver glycogen within 12 hours, but will not restore your muscle glycogen. And the reason I want to touch on this is because then you look at another study, which was done by Jeff Rothschild and Dan Plews, and they looked at, this is 22, they looked at 106 cyclists, male, females, and they were looking at factors that influence fat adaptation or fat oxidation. And there's heaps, there's many and there's varied, there's modifiable and there's measured. So the things that you can actually modify and measure easily, time and duration of training, the biggest factor, how much time you train, pretty easy. The intensity in training, probably zone 2, low zone 3. Daily intake of macros, so how well you do in terms of total calorie intake, the split of protein, fat, and carbs. Muscle glycogen content, go back to point 2 there. Does it actually get fully topped up at the end of each day? And then with all of those easily modifiable and measurable factors, they only explain 33% of the variation in day-to-day, the way it's called RER, but the way in which fat oxidation works. So there's heaps of things that are completely out of your control that you can't, like things like age and sex and stuff like that, that you can't do anything about. So I think everyone gets like fully wound up about how do I actually do this? And yes, you can do it in short-term ways, go really high fat, you'll improve fat oxidation, but you'll ruin your ability to have carb oxidation or high carb oxidation. So the big take home here is probably on a day-to-day basis, you're never fully replenishing your muscle glycogen. And therefore, if you do consecutive training and you do enough training, even with high intensity, low intensity, taking in lots of carbs, you will still see changes in fat adaptation or fat oxidation over time. You don't have to do anything magic. You just train consistently and constantly.
That's good to hear. And that's pretty much always been my stance when athletes ask that, because I think there's always that risk of under eating or under fueling if you try and do some of these things too regularly. Or
correct. I think that's the biggest risk when people, you talk of faster training. Oh, I'll just skip a meal because I think it's going to, again, the confusion. If I skip a meal, I'm going to burn more calories and therefore I'm going to become a better fat burner, but I'm also going to lose more fat. No, you're probably just going to have a really shit session and you're probably going to feel shit for the rest of the day. You do it for about 5 days, maybe a couple of weeks, and you're like, I can't do this anymore. This sport sucks. I really don't enjoy the training. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Grant.
I remember reading years ago, and I'm not going to say that this is absolutely accurate, but I remember reading like a well-known American endurance coach saying, on this subject. He just summed it up really simply. He said, if you're doing over 600 TSS a week, it'll just take care of itself. And I mean, I don't know whether that's accurate or anything, but I mean, that's roughly 10 to 12 hours a week of training, which is probably 2 sessions a day. Exactly what you're saying, basically, that continued training with mixed intensities, etc., and it will start to take care of itself.
Like, you can get in your own head, and I will 100% say, even personally, from personal experience, I'm trying to do something in a marathon I haven't done before. Training volume has gone up. I'm like, was getting annoyed. Like, why isn't my weight dropping? Because I need to drop some weight because I'm generally a bigger guy. And I was like looking through it. At the end of the day, I hadn't been doing the training I needed to do. I wasn't being consistent enough. I looked through my food logging. I was going over. It wasn't a lot, but I was probably going over on some days 300 calories. Okay, from an estimation through food logging on Fuelin. When I start to dial it in, when I start to actually do the training based on the intensity, the volume, and I start to bring the nutrition in line, wow, things start to shift. 2 weeks of that, I start to see progress. But it's just stepping back from it. Stop questioning everything and look at what's actually happening in front of you and do the hard thing and say, am I actually doing what I'm being asked to do or I intend to do? And if you're not, then do something about it and stop complaining. Because that's probably the biggest thing that, like, everyone can fall into it, including myself. But you just need to take a step back and probably stop blaming. It's the biggest thing. Don't blame anyone. Probably blame yourself.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to cover body composition today, but you know, if you're trying to get your body composition sorted for this marathon, we know this guy. Actually, he's a nutritionalist. He's got this great app that's been around for several years. I'll put you in touch with him after the show. So,
what was that TSS number? I just want to actually. I mean,
look again. I read this
what
years
did you
ago.
say? 600?
I think he said 600 TSS. Which is a relatively big number for a lot of amateur athletes, but yeah.
So that is a big number. Like, I'm just looking through, like, yeah, my TSS is like 500, like, just like,
and there you go. We've just solved your problem.
That's the thing. I'm like, and I feel like, well, I'm only running and biking, but I'm not having to swim. But like, that's the reality of the situation. Like, again, like, you go, how hard am I working? Well, maybe I can do a bit more. Like,
I mean, you go down a whole rabbit hole for runners here, couldn't you have? But if you train multi-sport, you can get more volume, you can generate, more
correct.
time.
I'm doing 4, I'm doing 4 run sessions, 2 bike, 2 strength. So you do the lot more cycling, you can probably generate a lot more of that TSS. Anyway, let's keep going. We've got another question around fat adaptation.
So, I mean, you've kind of partly answered this, but we'll follow on anyway because it might get a little bit more insight. With that high TSS or with that multiple training a day, and you become a little bit more fat adapted, do you still need as many carbs in races?
Yeah, look, potentially. Being better fat adapted means everything shifts to the right if you're thinking of the curve. So as the intensity, as the duration goes, you still utilize more fat than carbs. So potentially it could preserve some muscle glycogen, liver glycogen at those lower intensities because you're better at using it at the lower intensities. I guess the caveat for this, again, comes down to the intensity that you want to compete at. Are you going to be competing at those very low intensities during a race? Probably not. The other thing to remember is that beyond sort of 2 hours, you're likely to see peak fat oxidation and peak carbohydrate oxidation rates, even with very high carbohydrate intake during the race. You want to be good. You definitely don't want to have terrible fat oxidation rates. If I look at the very good athletes that I work with, what am I more interested in now? Probably their ability to utilize carbohydrates because they're going so fast. I mean, you look at 70.3 times now, 3 and a bit hours. Ironman, 8 hours. 8 hours is obviously still a long time, but 70.3 times are crazy. So yeah, it's all about carbs for those guys and girls.
And if you think about metabolizing fats versus carbs. Carbs is a lot more efficient, right?
Correct. It's a higher oxygen. You're gonna, I mean, look, again, it depends on how fast you're running. All that gets probably overplayed, but yes, there is a higher cost to utilizing fat as a fuel source from an oxygen consumption standpoint.
Good.
We're doing well. We're nearly
jump
there.
on to next subject is recovery.
Yep.
A couple of questions here. So my statement for this one, true or false, is the key component of recovery is protein.
False. Protein's part of the puzzle. It's part of the recovery puzzle. For endurance athletes, I would argue refueling is a bigger bang for buck for gains. And when we talk about refueling carbohydrates, think of your 4 Rs in this order: refuel, repair, rehydrate, rest. Maybe a 5th R, regulate, which relates to maybe HRV, heart rate, which is probably influenced by those first four Rs. The recovery window, it's not 20 minutes. Okay. Definitely not 20 minutes. So you don't need to panic when you finish your stopwatch. You got time. It's probably closer to 2 hours. That recovery window, if you've got back-to-back sessions or 2 sessions in a day, definitely comes down a little bit. And I would say within 60 minutes, you want to get in your carbohydrates and protein. Comes back to that liver versus muscle glycogen study, and I'll give the reference to you guys. But again, like, you think about that, if you've got a subsequent session that day or next day and it's high intensity and you're trying to replenish to ensure that you are good to go, you're talking 10 grams per kilo of body weight. Most athletes never get anywhere near 10 grams per kilo. So that's just something to think about. Carbohydrates and protein together do increase glycogen resynthesis, but mainly when carbs are sort of suboptimal, which again, if we think of majority of the athletes, I think out there, even when, something like Fuelin is telling them, okay, you got to eat, 5-6 grams per kilo body weight because they're trying to be in a fat loss or a weight loss program, when the carbohydrate amount is not necessarily optimal in a research setting, but more practical, the protein intake with the carbohydrates, combining whole foods together, think of, eggs or chicken or tofu, whatever you're combining with the carbs, the breads, the vegetables, the pastas, the potatoes, whatever, that's when it becomes really important, the protein and carbs together, because it will help to maximize that glycogen resynthesis. And that's how athletes should be thinking. I need to pair them together to maximize the ability to make some glycogen or store some glycogen, because actually I don't take in enough carbs on a day-to-day basis. So think carbs first, protein supports. The other really lovely thing, if you really want to be a dick about this, carbohydrates blunt cortisol, because I know every athlete thinks cortisol is like this terrible thing. But if from a stress hormone perspective, if you want to blunt cortisol, the easiest way to do it is take on some carbs.
So carbs and protein are king for that recovery meal. This is one that I hadn't really heard before, but fat with that recovery meal, does it slow down that recovery process?
As far as I know, false. High fat intake could slow down gastric emptying. You take in a lot of fat and it can also speed it up pretty quickly. You listen to, I can't remember, I was listening to Tim Ferriss the other day, and he was talking about his cocktail of sardines, ketones, and MCT oil for breakfast with a coffee. And he's like, you just need to be very close to a toilet when you're taking all that on. And I was like, "Eugh." So yeah, look, it will slow down gastric emptying. Could it slow down recovery? If you're talking about recovery from a fat loss perspective, potentially. If you're taking in a huge amount of fat, you're taking in a huge amount of calories. If the calories exceed your expenditure, it's certainly going to slow down loss of fat and loss of weight. So yeah, I would move on. I would say next. Don't think
Good. Right, we jump into, I think this is the most fun section, supplements and marginal gains. So There's so much conversation about supplements, and I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, isn't it? And so much marketing hype around it. So we're going to go in slightly granular. Another pun here. Salt tablets are essential for racing.
False. They're not, again, I'm only saying false because they're not essential. Fluid balance first, sodium to follow. Depending on, if you need electrolytes or sodium, you could use salt tablets, you could use salt chews, you could use a salt powder. So whether you go for salt tablets or not, it's really not important. I would direct everyone just to listen to the 3-part series that I did with Dr. Alan McCubbin on his very interesting review paper. Yes, it is a review paper based on studies and including his own studies that he has been involved with regards to electrolytes. I think he takes a very balanced view on sodium. He explains when he believes it should be used, when it maybe shouldn't be used, and when you should be thinking about the use of sodium. So I think the way we break it down is exactly based on the paper, which is an open access paper. Again, I'll share the link with Phil to share, but it's about sodium on a habitual basis. Should you just be taking in electrolytes on a daily basis, before exercise, during exercise, after exercise? And it's just and then how to do it. It's just a very easy 3-part series to follow and to make you think. I think above all things, it's not about poo-pooing electrolytes or anything like that. It's about just thinking about how you're using them. A bit like the conversation we just had about 120 grams of carbs. Same thing. Not everyone needs 120 grams of carbs. Not everyone needs 1,500 milligrams of sodium in their drink bottle.
We'll share the link and the link to the 3-part series as well in the show notes below.
Next one is broken into a few parts, but we'll start with supplements. Are they game changers?
False. Training combined with nutrition, obviously Fuelin, plus sleep is the game-changing combination. Supplements are complements to this. So think of your big rocks: training, nutrition, sleep. Get those 3 in order before you go and waste your money on supplements.
And then there's a couple of supplements that we'll get into very quickly. Tart cherry juice, all the pro riders seem to be using it. Is it a super recovery tool?
I will again give you a paper. I had a look at this, systematic review, meta-analyses on tart cherry juice. It certainly can improve muscle function. It can improve some markers of inflammation, but it also has no impact on other markers of inflammation after heavy exercise-induced damage. Could be worthwhile supplementing during periods of very intense exercise, hence why professional cyclists might be doing it. And again, think of the population who's using it and maybe the populations who are being studied. Are you pushing 1,000 TSS daily versus maybe 200 across the week or whatever? And it's like, you start to see where it could be, beneficial. I think important things in terms of it's called interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory marker, which is commonly studied in inflammation, systemic inflammation. It does have a positive impact on that, but it doesn't have an impact on C-reactive protein, which is another common marker. What that means, don't really know. Reading through the systematic review, they didn't really say, what is that going to mean to the athlete? Maybe it makes you feel a little bit better. There's no difference for the inflammatory markers, 60 mils versus 240. So if you're doing it for inflammation, have a 60 mil shot. What it did have an impact on, though, is markers of muscle function. So in terms of the ability to generate isometric strength, was some markers that they looked at that actually did appear to have a decent impact on. Again, if you think of these pro riders, why are they doing it? Because they want their muscles to fire on all cylinders. In that case, 260 mils was seen to be the magic dose 240 for reduction in a certain inflammatory marker, 260 mils for muscle function. Therefore, if you want the muscle function, if you want maybe a blunting of some of these inflammatory markers during periods of intense training where you want to be able to back up, or you've got a multi-stage race, 260 mils of tart cherry juice, it's not going to do you any harm. And it tastes pretty good.
Good. So I guess a similar one here. We're going to. This came from a question on beetroot consumption. So nitrates are great for short efforts, but limited use over longer distances.
False. The reason I say false is, yes, a lot of the studies have shown improvements in, say, time trial performance or time to exhaustion, short bouts of exercise. But I think where nitrates, beta-lane and betaine and these sort of, the pine bark extract, the stuff you find in plasmade, if you use these, which effectively cause like dilation, vasodilation of the arterial wall, if you're doing better quality training or higher intensity training more regularly, is that advantageous in the long run to create adaptation over time? And that's where I think some of these short-term supplements, things like beta-alanine, potentially even sodium bicarbonate, things like nitrates, can be used at specific times during periods of very intense exercise, which is done for a period of like a block, to create that adaptation over time. And that's how I'd be thinking about it. Certainly we see improved blood pressure, exercise tolerance when it's done repeatedly. So 400 milligrams a day is generally the recommended dose. If you try and do that without a beet concentrate, good luck. You're probably drinking about 1.5 liters of the stuff. If you want to have it in a measured shot with a informed sport certification, Beat It Elite is probably the supplement that I would be recommending. Beat It Elite is a good UK company, I believe. I'm definitely not sponsored by them and have no affiliation, but I've used them plenty of times with many athletes, and I think it is beneficial from a health and performance perspective. So there's certainly no harm in taking increased amounts of dietary nitrates on a habitual basis as well. Just becomes expensive.
And you get lovely red pea, which can be concerning at times.
Correct.
I've got a story about that, but it's not for on this podcast. So. Anyway.
Creatine, is it great for aging athletes?
False. Creatine monohydrate, Crea Pure, is good for all athletes. Male, female, young, older, old. Just take it. Stop worrying about, is it the right thing? Just get on it. 5 grams a day, honestly. For all the benefits, most of you listening, it might make me a little bit heavier. Whatever. Like, it's just not even worth worrying about. Like, for all the benefits that creatine conveys and confers to the person taking it on a regular basis, I just, from a health and performance perspective, and yes, you could probably, you can go into the studies and get into the weeds, but I think it is the most studied, ergogenic supplement outside of caffeine, carbohydrates, and water, and showing benefits clearly time and time again. I just don't understand the argument against not taking it. And then you layer in some of the cognitive benefits that is being shown. Not definitive. I think it's a bit blown out of the water. We're still, I think, away from knowing exactly how beneficial it is to the brain. But, early studies and science seem to suggest that it is beneficial from a cognitive standpoint as well. So at this point in time, I can't see any reason why not everyone should be taking it.
Well, there we go. Everyone knows where to spend their pocket money.
If you're going to buy a supplement, I'll give you the lowdown. Here's my 3 supplements that everyone should take. A protein supplement, because you're doing endurance exercise and your protein intake is going to be at least 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight. And for most athletes, they struggle to eat that amount of protein relative to their body size. So complementing that with a good quality whey protein isolate or a multi-blend plant protein isolate would be an essential supplement to have in your cupboard. Just make sure it's very good quality. The second one would be creatine monohydrate in the form of Crea Pure. The third one would be omega-3s, and make sure that the EPA, DHA content per pill is at least sort of 800 milligrams per pill. So you're not having to knock back 30 of the little suckers to get 3,000 milligrams in per day of EPA and DHA. And because you're all in the Northern Hemisphere, the bonus vitamin would be vitamin D3, that you should obviously get your vitamin D3 levels checked. But even without getting it checked, I can guarantee you want to be taking vitamin D3 if you live in England.
Perfect. That's a really good, solid way to look at it. And yeah, no different to I think what we generally advise, except the creatine monohydrate. You've really sold there. So yeah, something to consider. So look, we're going to round this up with a little bit of race day strategy. 3 quick fire questions here. True or false? Drinking to thirst is the best strategy for racing.
False. Understanding your sweat rate provides a range to follow based on the environment and the type of racing you're doing. You understand that by weighing yourself before and after sessions. You can work it out yourself, or you can just plug it into Fuelin, whatever you want to do. But you should be documenting what you're drinking and everything like that, and understanding what your sweat rate is. For extremely high sweat rates, this could apply because you just may not ever meet your fluid requirements. You just drink as much as you can based on how you're feeling, and that may be the best way to go about it. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Is it gels that give GI issues in races?
False. There's so many factors involved in, GI disturbances. I think come back to, what we were talking about, very first question, complex carbs, fiber. That could be part of the factor here. You just don't take any fiber, so you've got actually very fast, loose bowels because you've got nothing holding it together, and you start layering in, very refined carbohydrates with fluids and sodium and everything, and it just goes straight through you. So I think habitual intake of carbs, habitual intake of fiber, gut health in general, how is it? That probably relates to your fiber intake. Use of fuel or carbs in training, the specificity of training. Are you doing race intensity training with the carbohydrate products or fuel products and fluid products that you intend to use in a race? Your fluid intake, your fluid balance, the temperature at which you're training versus the temperature in which you're going to be racing. And then finally, the products, ingredients. What are you taking in, and are they just terrible products that probably sold you on some marketing garble? Which goes in perfectly to the very last question.
Perfectly to the last question, which is, so, I mean, the context behind this is I always hear athletes talking about, oh, I take this brand, I take that brand, this one works for me, that one works for me. So the question is, certain brands of sports products are better for some athletes than others.
Depends how you read the question. I said true. I said certain brands of sports products are better.
I think
now,
that's
are they
what
better
we're
for
asking,
some? Yeah. I think some brands are just full of shit, literally, like the products and the ingredients. I think some of them are based on scientific principles. Some of the products have chosen certain aspects of science to make claims for their products. I think when it comes down to it, and what I always say to people is like, if you're going to read the studies revolving around carbohydrate intake, they don't involve chia seeds. They don't involve mango purees and all this stuff. What they involve generally is maltodextrin, glucose, fructose. And they have that in varying ratios, and they'll have that in varying amounts. And that is generally what they're assessing. Now, I know that's a clinical study, but I also know that that's shown time and time again to when they're looking at performance benefits and the ways in which carbohydrates work, if we're talking specifically around carbohydrates. So what would I look for? If we're talking specifically around carbohydrates, I'd be looking at the ingredients to contain glucose, fructose, maltodextrin, sucrose, maybe, which is a combination of glucose and fructose anyway in a 1-to-1 ratio. I'd look at the ratio, again, depending on how much total carbs you're taking in. If you're taking in less than 60 grams an hour, you can actually just have maltodextrin or glucose only as a product. And that may help, back to the question before, maybe that will help you with your GI issues because you're not taking any fructose in. Fructose is associated with maybe higher levels of GI distress. Once you get beyond that sort of 60, 80 grams an hour, yeah, multiple types of carbs, i.e. maltodextrin, glucose with fructose is going to be important. As that number gets higher and higher, the ratio is probably going to change from like a 2-to-1 to like a 1-to-1. Looking at the different products that do that, you can mix and match. Again, I always look at them and go, are they really 1 to 0.8 ratio? Because it was probably a massive vat and it was all stirred up and, what's on the label, you take with a pinch of salt or a pinch of sodium maybe, and just, have a little bit of flexibility in the way you think about this. What it comes down to is trial and error, repeatability, consistency in practicing these things in training, in the appropriate sessions with the appropriate duration and the appropriate intensity, practicing that time and again, not one day or one session the week before your race and hoping that you'll have a good race. It's doing it consistently for weeks and weeks and weeks in the lead up to that race.
Awesome.
Just what I picked up on there as well, these ratios, because we actually did get asked a specific question on this, which I didn't include, but you've actually answered it quite nicely. So just summarizing that, you could just take straight glucose for up to 60 grams an hour. I think a lot of people sort of know that. And then these ratios that are on packets that sort of confuse people which one's best. What you're generally saying is 2-to-1 is probably the next step to take because that's basically the introduction of another sugar, isn't it? And then that the introduction of the other sugars becomes higher and higher, the more carbohydrate you need to get in, going to a 1-to-1-ish ratio as you get to that sort of, I need to take in an awful lot of carbohydrate an hour type person.
Yeah, you think about, okay, let's say you're 2-to-1, that's 80 grams of, then you're looking at 80 grams of glucose or maltodextrin, which is a polymer or a long chain of glucose with 40 grams of fructose. Can you get that from the products? Yeah, but then you start going over 120 grams. Okay, well, now you may be running a risk of taking in too much glucose. And even with that 80 grams of glucose, if you're using all 2-to-1 ratios, maybe that's where the problem lies. If you are taking in 120 grams and 80 grams of that is glucose or maltodextrin, that could be part of the problem. Maybe you are saturating those transporters, and that may theoretically cause an issue.
Brilliant.
Awesome.
Right, we got through everything quite nicely there. So
we didn't do it in 30 minutes though.
We did, but there was some real good takeaways from that, Scott. So really appreciate it. I learned a few things myself there. So really good. Appreciate you coming on as ever, and you can get off to bed now over in Oz, and we'll crack on with the day.
Nah, perfect. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Nice one. Thank you.